From the Diary of Bill Lowie, Monday, November 2nd. Last night, the American compound at Bien Hoa was attacked by the VC using .81 mm mortars. Bien Hoa had the largest number of aircraft and personnel in all of Vietnam outside of Dan Son Hout in Saigon. 6 Americans were killed and 19 injured. 17 Air Force planes and 3 Army helicopters were damaged. The raid was a hit-and-run affair, and the VC suffered no casualties. This entry provides a stark look at the vulnerabilities faced by American forces stationed at critical sites in Vietnam. On November 1st, the American compound at Bien Hoa endured a Viet Cong mortar attack, an assault that tragically left 6 dead and 19 injured, while also inflicting significant damage on Air Force and Army aircraft. The Bien Hoa Air Base, which was only 16 miles from Saigon and second in scale only to Tan Son Nhut, was a hub of American military power, housing a large concentration of aircraft and personnel. This made it an attractive target for the Viet Cong. Bien Hoa's role in the war effort made this attack a significant blow. As one of the largest bases outside of Saigon, it not only served as a major logistics and supply hub, but also supported key tactical operations. The attack on Bien Hoa sent a message about the reach and resourcefulness of the Viet Cong, who could disrupt operations at one of the most important American strongholds in Vietnam, challenging the perception of security even in heavily guarded areas. The Bien Hoa Air Base was a major U.S. and South Vietnamese military airfield. Established in the 1950s by the French Air Force, it became a key center of operations during the Vietnam War. Eventually, after the Americans took over, the MAG requested that the U.S. Navy construct multiple jet-capable airfields across South Vietnam, which included Bien Hoa. As the conflict escalated, Bien Hoa hosted a substantial concentration of military personnel and equipment. The airbase housed units from both the U.S. Air Force and Army, as well as South Vietnamese forces serving in the Republic of Vietnam Air Force. The airfield served as a joint base and acted as a hub for numerous combat and support aircraft, including F-100 Super Sabres, B-57 Canberras, UH-1 helicopters, and U-2 reconnaissance planes. This made it an essential point for launching and supporting missions, including tactical bombing, close air support, and reconnaissance, especially in areas under heavy Viet Cong and North Vietnamese influence. Bien Hoa's scale and importance also made it a frequent target. The November 1964 attack noted by my grandfather was one of the first large-scale Viet Cong attacks on an American installation and was a well-documented event. One inconsistency reported by Poppy is the casualties he listed. He stated there were 6 Americans that died, but in fact it was 4 Americans and 2 South Vietnamese. Though this distinction is mostly irrelevant, since they were on the same side, it demonstrates the quality of information other soldiers were receiving during the war. As a researcher, it's a fascinating mistake to see Poppy make. Using mortars, the Viet Cong inflicted considerable damage on American aircraft and personnel, demonstrating their ability to launch organized, devastating attacks. This event marked a shift in the U.S. military's approach, as it prompted a greater focus on perimeter security and intelligence gathering to protect other bases from similar assaults. An earlier attack on soldiers guarding the base perimeter in 1962 actually led to a defoliation campaign in the jungle surrounding the airfield, where H-34 helicopters were sent out to spray Agent Orange and other defoliators around the base. This operation continued as the base became more important and endured more attacks. Although there were no VC casualties during a raid, a Republic of Vietnam Air Force commander later launched a retaliatory attack on November 6 on a VC base and claimed to have killed 500 VC in response. Throughout the war, Bien Hoa remained a center of intense military activity, often functioning as a base for major air campaigns such as Operation Rolling Thunder and Operation Arc Light. Following the Tet Offensive in 1968, it became an even more critical launching point for operations. As U.S. involvement wound down in the 1970s, Bien Hoa was gradually handed over to South Vietnamese forces, who used it until the fall of Saigon in 1975. The airfield is also known for the 1965 Bien Hoa disaster, in which there was a catastrophic explosion at the base on May 16, 1965, when a chain reaction of blasts destroyed multiple American B-57 bombers and killed or injured over 100 personnel. The incident began when a bomb accidentally detonated on the runway, triggering a series of explosions that rapidly spread across the airfield, igniting bombs, fuel, and munitions. The devastation significantly impacted U.S. air operations and highlighted the dangers posed by the sheer volume of explosive material stored on bases like Bien Hoa. In response, the disaster prompted heightened safety protocols and increased scrutiny on munition storage practices to prevent similar tragedies in the future. Bien Hoi's story reflects the complex and often perilous environment U.S. forces encountered in Vietnam. Despite its powerful arsenal and defenses, the base was always at risk, showing the high stakes of holding territory in a conflict defined by guerrilla tactics and an ever-present enemy. Today, the U.S. is still active in the area, assisting the Vietnamese government in decontaminating the base of Agent Orange. The site is said to possess the most contaminated soil and waterways in Vietnam. The photo I chose for today appears to depict the exact situation Poppy has described, the attack on the airfield. There are multiple bomber planes which have been mortared and caught fire. The photo also shows multiple personnel surveying the damage while standing around a fire truck. From the Diary of Bill Lowie, Wednesday, November 4th. It is very close to election time in the U.S., and things are very quiet here. There was a big troop lift about 80 miles south of here in the area of Ca Mau. Some 89 known VC dead and untold wounded. Also, 3 60mm mortars were captured. 1 ARVN was killed. In this entry, Poppy describes the wartime rhythms that somehow mirrored the political timelines back home. With the U.S. election nearing, he notes an unexpected lull in activity, a temporary calm during what was otherwise a turbulent period in Vietnam. Yet, this quiet was contrasted by a significant troop lift operation south near Ca Mau. In that operation, ARVN forces, with U.S. support, engaged in intense combat with the Viet Cong, resulting in 89 confirmed enemy deaths, numerous wounded, and the capture of 3 60mm mortars. As we saw with last episode, these types of mortars were crucial Viet Cong weapons, often used in their swift hit-and-run style of warfare. Yet, even with the high enemy casualties, ARVN experienced just 1 fatality, a testament to the tactical differences and complexities of these ground confrontations. This particular region, Ca Mau, located in the southernmost part of Vietnam, was a challenging area with dense mangrove forests, swamps, and extensive waterways. It was an ideal hiding place for the Viet Cong, who used the terrain to their advantage. Poppy's mention of this successful but bloody engagement highlights the ongoing, complex struggle for control over strategic areas, even as the home front remained focused on its own shifting political landscape. The 1964 U.S. presidential election was one of the most ideologically charged in American history, with incumbent Democrat Lyndon B. Johnson facing off against Republican Barry Goldwater. Each candidate stood on the opposite ends of the political spectrum, and the key issues of the election would shape the nation's future. Of the many issues at hand, the civil rights movement may have been at the forefront. In 1964, racial tensions ran high as the fight for equality gained momentum across the country. Johnson had just signed the Civil Rights Act of 1964, a landmark piece of legislation that banned racial segregation in schools, workplaces, and public facilities. A year earlier, in 1963, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. had just given his famous I Have a Dream speech, and by December of 1964, he will be awarded his Nobel Peace Prize. Also, it is worthy of note that Malcolm X was still alive in this period, later getting assassinated in February of 1965. Needless to say, the civil rights movement was a central issue in this election. Johnson's firm support for civil rights was risky. It was driving a wedge between him and the Democratic South. Goldwater, meanwhile, opposed the act, not on racial grounds, he claimed, but as a matter of states' rights. This stance resonated with Southern conservatives, but many critics saw it as racially insensitive. National security was also a pressing issue. The Cold War loomed large and Americans were on edge. Johnson favored a policy of containment, aiming to stop the spread of communism without triggering direct conflict. Goldwater, on the other hand, took a hardline stance. He openly discussed the possibility of using nuclear weapons if necessary. This led to Johnson's famous Daisy ad, which warned Americans of the dangers of nuclear war. The ad begins with a little girl in a field pulling the petals off a daisy and counting up every time she pulled one. When she is done, a voice from off-screen begins to count down. When the voice reaches 0, footage of nuclear explosions are shown. Another voice states, "These are the stakes: to make a world in which all of God's children could live, or to go into the dark. We must either love each other, or we must die. Vote for President Johnson on November 3rd. The stakes are too high for you to stay home." The ad clearly implied that Goldwater's approach to the Cold War was recklessly hawkish, even going so far as to suggest that his policies could lead to a nuclear conflict and ultimately the end of the world. Although not yet the substantial issue it would later become, the Vietnam War was slowly creeping into the minds of the Americans. Johnson advocated for a measured escalation in Vietnam, while Goldwater argued for a more aggressive approach. However, in 1964, few could have imagined how deeply this conflict would later define Johnson's presidency and divide the American public. On the home front, Johnson introduced his ambitious Great Society program. His vision aimed to tackle poverty, racial injustice, and improve access to education and healthcare. It was a bold vision for America and marked a clear expansion of government's role in people's lives. Goldwater, however, argued against increased government intervention. He warned that Johnson's plans would lead to a bloated federal government and higher taxes. He believed in a free market approach, advocating for personal responsibility and less federal control. Finally, the issue of law and order made its way into the conversation. With rising crime rates and unrest in American cities, Goldwater advocated for a strong stance on law and order, framing Johnson's policies as too permissive. Johnson countered by emphasizing the need to address poverty and inequality to combat crime at its roots. The 1964 election remains a pivotal moment where America faced questions that still resonate today. Questions of civil rights, the role of government, national security, and the nature of American power in the world. When this episode is published, it will be only one day before the 2024 U.S. presidential election, one which reflects the increasing political rhetoric of contemporary American politics, which frame it as the most important election of our lifetime. President Biden has even gone so far as to say that recent elections are a battle for the soul of the nation. Given the context of the election 60 years ago, I ask, what has changed? Are the issues so different? What were the things that were a priority for Poppy? Was he worried about the Vietnam War expanding? Or was he grappling with greater, even more pressing existential threats of nuclear war? One candidate had no problem implying that the election of the other could lead to the end of the world. How does that relate to what is being said today? After all, if Kamala gets elected, the country is certain to fall into communism. But if Trump gets a second term, the country will lead the world into a liberal fascism. Are these consequences not, at the very least, the end of the world as we know it? I'd like to take this time to ask you, the listener, to consider the parallels between these two moments in time. What do they say for what is going on today? Do we not still have a new but increasingly hostile conflict with Russia? Are things more or less stable than they were no more than 20 years after the defeat of the Nazis in World War II? How did these people feel about technology, and how does it relate to how we feel today about the dangers of AI in the information age? If you would indulge me for a moment, these questions remind me of a quote from the Bible. I'm not one to share verses, but for some reason today this one feels suitable. Perhaps we can find wisdom through these words. Ecclesiastes 1:3-11. What do people gain from all their labors at which they toil under the sun? Generations come and generations go, but the earth remains forever. The sun rises and the sun sets and hurries back to where it rises. The wind blows to the south and turns to the north. Round and round it goes, ever returning on its course. All streams flow into the sea, yet the sea is never full. To the place the streams come from, there they return again. All things are wearisome, more than one can say. The eye never has enough of seeing, nor the ear its fill of hearing. What has been will be again. What has been done will be done again. There is nothing new under the sun. Is there anything of which one can say, "Look, this is something new"? It was here already, long ago. It was here before our time. No one remembers the former generations, and even those yet to come will not be remembered by those who follow them. The photo I chose for today depicts Poppy standing in front of a sign with different names of towns painted on individual arrows. Beside each town name is a number marking the distance from that town. This sign was a point of reference for Poppy, informing how far from home he was and in what direction. Maybe it was a reminder of what he was fighting for. Perhaps it was just a fun sign. He looks a lot like one of my cousins in this picture. From the Diary of Bill Lowie, Saturday, November 8th. An L-19 aircraft was reported down and lost between Vung Xiao and Bien Hoa. We sent search and rescue teams up, but they could find nothing of the plane or pilot. Next in his diary, there was another entry, dated Sunday, November 8th. Troop lift into a fairly secure area. No contact was made. I was originally going to separate these two into different episodes, as they are two entries. However, since they are so short, I figured I'd combine them. Not much seems to be reported here by Poppy, just what is seeming to be increasingly more typical activity. The L-19 Bird Dog, also known as a Cessna 01, was a versatile single-engine aircraft used extensively in Vietnam for reconnaissance, observation, and forward air control missions. Known for its agility and reliability, the L-19 was ideal for navigating the dense jungle terrain and spotting enemy movements that were otherwise hidden from ground patrols. Pilots flying the Bird Dog often directed artillery and airstrikes, providing crucial real-time intelligence to ground forces. While unarmed, the L-19 would occasionally mark targets with smoke rockets, guiding fighter jets or bombers to precise locations. Despite its effectiveness, the L-19's low-altitude flights and slow speeds made it vulnerable to enemy fire, placing pilots in constant danger as they flew missions over hostile areas to gather critical information. To resolve what we discussed last episode, the 1964 U.S. presidential election ended in a decisive victory for incumbent President Lyndon B. Johnson, a Democrat, who defeated Republican challenger Barry Goldwater by a substantial margin. Johnson won approximately 61% of the popular vote and carried 44 states, resulting in 486 electoral votes to Goldwater's 52. The election solidified the Democratic Party's commitment to civil rights and marked a turning point in American politics, shaping the national dialogue for years to come. This election marked what is typically referred to as a big flip in national politics, where Republicans and Democrats effectively switched party platforms. Though this is an oversimplification of what happened, it is an important turning point in U.S. history. To conclude, here's the second thing I wrote about Poppy after I started working with his materials. It's a true story, at least as true as it can be anyway. I met him in my dream. I had a dream the other night. Well, I have dreams almost every night, but this one was different. If you'd be willing to listen, I'd love to tell you about it. I had a dream that I was in a dark restaurant, perhaps a bar. The lights were low, maybe they were gas or candle, I don't know. But I was one of the few patrons. My table was directly in the center, and the waitress was very attentive. She visited often, making sure my drink was full, and seemed intent that I have a good meal. I didn't know what was so important. Then, the front door swung open, and he took a step in. He looked like how I knew him, gray and frail and a face full of wrinkles. But he also looked like an amalgamation of every picture I've ever seen of him. He was simultaneously a child and an old man, a soldier and a fisherman, an absent father and a drunk. He took off his officer's hat that might have actually been a pilot's helmet, or the trucker hat for a cigarette company he would wear occasionally. He scanned the room and found me. We locked eyes. He marched toward me in a perfect stride, debonair and confident, but also weak and labored, like a weight on his shoulders grew with every step. The waitress pulled out his seat for him, possibly because she respected his strong military essence, or maybe she was afraid he'd fall and break a hip if he tried to do it himself. "Hey, guy," he said, giving me a wink and a chuckle. Was he clean-shaven, or did he have a mustache that I always saw? It was hard to tell. Maybe because it was dark. He ordered a drink, something strong and with little ice, like what someone who had been around a bottle would order. Actually, it looked like a glass of wine. My cousin told me that was his drink of choice after all. He then pulled out a cigarette, with impressive style, a lighter, flicking it open and lighting the tip in one single impressive motion. Was that his officer training, or just decades of practice? "Hey, Poppy," I said back. Was it really him? Did it really matter? He was there. I know his presence. "What are you doing here?" I asked. "I don't know," he replied. "You tell me." He seemed happy. I had never really seen him happy. Maybe he was at peace. The waitress came out with his drink and 2 entrees, steaks and potatoes, his favorite, the only meal he ever asked Meemaw to make, or at least the only one I remember. "Well," I hesitated, "I hadn't thought about what I'd say if we got here. I've been doing this work with your photographs and your writing, and I never got a chance to think about what I'd say if you were sitting in front of me. Like now." He nodded confidently. "You know, it's been a long time since I've seen you," I continued. "Do you want me to be doing this? Are you proud of me?" Then I woke up. The photo I chose for today might be one of my favorites. It depicts an L-19 flying in the air, speeding past Hueys and Cobras on the ground. From the Diary of Bill Lowie, Monday, November 9th. Another troop lift into an area where a battalion of VC were supposed to be located. We were fired at by an automatic weapon. There were no hits from it. One armed ship was hit with a .30 caliber bullet in the cockpit. Luckily, no one was hit. Another gunship reported that he had been hit and had blood all over the cockpit. A rocket ship immediately put 2 rockets into 3 different grass shacks and killed no telling how many women and kids before the first ship could report that he had had a bird splatter into his cockpit instead of a round. 200 or so sampans were noted in one of the canals by the gunships, but they couldn't fire at them because the only people visible on the sampans were women and kids, a favorite trick of the VC. That down to L-19 has not been found yet. In his diary, it next says Tuesday, November 10th, and then is crossed out, and instead it says 10 p.m. Just as I was dozing off tonight, one of the guards on one of our outposts opened fire on 3 people out to his front. This firing woke everyone on the compound. There was a lot of speculation about what could be out beyond our defenses. And of course, the incident at Bien Hoa is still on everyone's mind. After all, the excitement died down, everyone went back to bed. Everyone, that is, except our installation defense officer. He decided to fire a few flares out in that area. Flares here are fired from an 81mm mortar, which is located about 30 yards from my room. The first round went off without any warning. My nerves will never be the same again. Our flare ship and 2 gunships are out scouting that area now. Meemaw told me the only thing that Poppy ever seemed to care about after returning from Vietnam were kids. They became his priority. I was told that he even wanted to adopt a little orphan girl that he found over there when he was traveling off base. The U.S. would not let him take her. There were too many logistical issues. Meemaw said she'd have been happy to adopt a kid, but it was just too much to get her over here. It always bothered Poppy that he couldn't do it, though. There was a convent that actually bordered the airfield at Vinh Long. According to Stars and Stripes, the U.S. military's newspaper, the convent had 8 nuns, 5 Irish, 2 Vietnamese, and 1 Malay. The convent ran a school for girls, where orphan girls or others who wanted to escape the war could go and have a place to live and go to school. Poppy told stories of going over to it and conversing with the nuns. They'd even make clothing or trinkets that they sold to the airmen. In fact, there are quite a few items of clothing that they had hand-stitched for Poppy. He got his boys matching shirts with the 114th Aviation Company's logo on it. He also got Charlie an exact replica of his warrant officer dress shirt. The nuns at one point reported having over 200 girls in the school. However, later in the war, in 1968, during the Tet Offensive, the VC used it as a staging area for an attack on Vinh Long, and many of the girls fled. Only about half returned. After that attack, the U.S. Army assigned only 3 soldiers to act as security for the convent. It is believed that the girl he wanted to adopt was one of those kids, an orphan who lived nearby and had the nuns looking after her. She had no one else. What else can a 27-year-old guy with 3 kids at home help but think when he saw a child so clearly in need? I understood that he deeply cared about children, without question. Why not? He had 10 grandchildren. He was a nice guy. Every year for Christmas, we'd buy him a special ornament from a store in our local mall that donated the proceeds to the Make-A-Wish Foundation. I asked my grandmother about this. She said he always had a soft spot for children, even before he went to Vietnam. In fact, Meemaw concluded, he seemed to care about kids even more so after he found out that he helped bomb an orphanage while over there. When she gave me this news a few years ago, I was shocked. That was not one of those stories you grew up hearing about from your family, and the way she said it was somewhat easygoing, very matter-of-fact. This information was disorientating. It was confusing. It was an explanation as to why he cared so much about children. It was guilt. He was guilty. He would always be guilty. He would never be able to atone for his sins. But every year, he'd try. He'd remind himself of what he did and pay an indulgence, or at least we would by buying him an ornament that year. What else was there for him to do? Eventually, we'll get to know more about the orphanage. Or maybe we won't. That doesn't matter much. It may have been something that changed his life, but he never talked about it. Instead, there were other things that he talked about. He wrote in today's entry that his nerves would never be the same again. That was true. I already told you about how the fireworks scared him, about his alcoholism. Perhaps this is partially to blame. A loud thump and an explosion outside of his room while he thought the commotion outside had died down scared him. The darkness around the compound, carrying every demon and ill omen his mind could conjure in the twilight while he tried to dream about anything and anywhere else besides Vietnam. What did it mean for an ally, a fellow American soldier, to wake him up like that? How did he react? Poppy's entry for today is brutal and reflects a growing hopelessness. Less than 2 months deployed, and he already seems to be giving up any optimism. This is a sad reminder of how quickly hope can fade away when one is faced with danger and death daily. What is there to be hopeful for when a friend of yours kills innocent women and children because a bird accidentally splattered against the windshield of an Allied helicopter? The photo I chose for today depicts a little girl posing. I've been told that allegedly this was a photo Poppy took to send to Meemaw to introduce the girl to her. It's blurry. The girl is smiling. Who knows what she was thinking when she had this photo taken? I'm sure that in a few days after this episode is released, I'll get a call from Meemaw telling me that it's the wrong girl, but she certainly couldn't remember which photo has the right one in it. So, for the sake of the project right now, I'll just say it was this one. From the Diary of Bill Lowie, Saturday, 14 November. Today, during the conduct of a normal resupply mission, we were called to fly medic evac. We were given a set of coordinates and told to drop what we were doing and proceed at once. When we arrived at the battle area, we were joined by 2 other ships from the company. We carried 15 wounded ARVN who had been caught in an ambush. They had 16 others killed. Some of the ones that we picked up were beyond help. One of them only had battered pulp for legs. Another had half his face blown away by a grenade. This entry provides a harrowing look at the immediate aftermath of an ambush, highlighting the brutal reality of war that Poppy encountered during a medical evacuation mission. During World War II, medical evacuation by air first emerged as a concept, though the practice remained limited. Fixed-wing aircraft were occasionally used to transport wounded soldiers, but evacuations were hampered by challenging terrain and logistical barriers. Ground transport, typically trucks and trains, continued to be the primary method for moving casualties. The Korean War marked a major shift with the introduction of helicopters like the Bell H-13 Sioux, which became iconic for its distinctive bubble canopy. The H-13 could airlift wounded soldiers to MASH, Mobile Army Surgical Hospital, units, offering quicker access to care and increasing survival rates. This war established helicopters as essential for casualty evacuation, even though early helicopters were still restricted to short-range missions. By the Vietnam War, helicopter technology had advanced, and the Huey revolutionized Medevac operations. Unlike earlier helicopters, it could carry multiple stretchers, medical personnel, and basic medical supplies, allowing medics to provide immediate care in flight. With over 7,000 Hueys deployed, they became lifelines for thousands, drastically improving survival rates by reaching the wounded within minutes. Medevac crews learned techniques like hot landings, where they rapidly descended, kept the engines running, and lifted off as soon as the wounded were loaded to minimize time on the ground. Missions involved not only the dangers of combat, but also the psychological toll of tending to catastrophic injuries as medics raced against time, knowing that every second mattered. The rescue teams relied on the golden hour, which is considered the first 60 minutes after injury and is a standard in emergency medical care. It is a crucial period where medical intervention can make the difference between life and death. Medevac helicopters like the Huey were vital in achieving the standard, boosting survival rates compared to previous conflicts. Since the Vietnam War, Medevac has continued to evolve, benefiting from technological advancements and the experiences of previous conflicts. Vietnam-era Medevac operations highlighted the critical role of helicopters in modern warfare, inspiring military and medical fields to improve equipment, training, and protocols. In the years following Vietnam, helicopters, such as the Black Hawk UH-60, replaced the Huey as a primary Medevac vehicle. The Black Hawk was faster, more heavily armored, and capable of carrying more patients and advanced medical equipment, which became especially relevant during conflicts in the Middle East, where distances were greater and conditions were more extreme than the jungles of Vietnam. In the Gulf War, Medevac teams faced the vast, open desert terrain where they needed longer-range, faster helicopters. The military had also enhanced onboard medical capabilities, equipping helicopters with defibrillators, advanced ventilators, and trauma kits, that allowed medics to provide a higher level of in-flight care. Battlefield medicine was also transformed by the introduction of mobile surgical teams, allowing Medevac helicopters to transport wounded soldiers to fully equipped facilities in theater rather than relying solely on field hospitals. During the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, Medevac operations encountered both urban and mountainous environments. The harsh landscapes and high altitudes of Afghanistan required specially modified helicopters, such as the UH-60M Blackhawk, which had more powerful engines to handle thin air and difficult takeoff conditions. Night vision technology also became standard, enabling nighttime rescues in hostile areas while minimizing exposure to enemy fire. Medevac teams faced improvised explosive devices and ambushes, leading to innovative pre-mission planning and improvements in aircraft survivability. A significant advancement was the implementation of en route care, where medics began to provide intensive, near-hospital-level care while en route to medical facilities. For example, critical care flight paramedics are trained not only in trauma care, but in advanced interventions, such as administering blood transfusions mid-flight, intubating patients, and performing other life-saving measures previously only possible in hospitals. This specialized training arose from the need for prolonged patient stabilization during lengthy transports, especially in remote areas. Today's Medevac operations are highly coordinated, integrating satellite navigation, real-time communication, and tracking technologies that allow seamless coordination among medics, pilots, and receiving hospitals. Additionally, the development of unmanned aerial vehicles, UAVs, for casualty evacuation is underway, promising a future where drones might handle basic evacuation roles in high-risk zones, reducing the need to send crews into immediate danger. Civilian emergency services worldwide have adopted military Medevac practices, enhancing urban and rural rescue operations with specialized air ambulance services equipped with nearly the same technology and trauma care procedures as the military. The photo I chose for today was one Poppy seems to have taken from his pilot's seat. It shows a man laying on the floor of the helicopter. He's bandaged up and wincing in pain. He appears to be an ARVN soldier. Clearly, they're in the process of a medical evacuation. Poppy still found time to take a picture, though. From the Diary of Bill Lowie, Monday, 16 November. It is 11 o'clock at night, and I can't get to sleep. We were warned by G2 that the VC planned to attack our base tonight at midnight. Everyone is still jumpy over the Bien Hoa incident. We are also under a typhoon alert tonight, and it is raining now and has been for the past 48 hours. A perfect night for an attack. We have 2 flare ships on alert on the ramp, but it is doubtful if they can take off if the wind gets any stronger. We also have an 81 mortar right outside my bunk firing a flare every once in a while. This is one of the reasons I can't sleep. Growing up, it was normal. Mimo had her own room, sleeping in a large king-sized bed that we would also sleep in when we spent the night. Her antique doll collection took up most of the space anyway. The ceramic eyes always staring when you tried to sleep. Poppy had his own room, much smaller but better suited for a skinny man who only needed his computer to be happy. He had one of the first TV-computer combinations. I failed to recall the name of the machine, however the logo is forever ingrained in my memory, used as a loading screen during the long buffering time of the dial-up connection. When you walked through the hallway at Mimo and Poppy's house, there would be Poppy with his door open, lying on his bed, arm behind his head, keyboard in his lap. I rarely thought about or questioned why they slept in separate bedrooms. My dad used to joke that it was the key to happiness and the only way that my grandmother would stick around through their 55-year marriage. My mother had a propensity for turning TV Land on in the background while doing chores at home. I regularly watched programs like I Love Lucy and The Dick Van Dyke Show, and those couples always slept in separate beds, perfectly staged in their room with matching pajamas. I figured that was just the way people their age did things. I was much older when I found out they had separate rooms due to Poppy's nightmares. This diary entry is probably the thing that caught my attention most about his writing years ago. It was the comments about sleep. It was the first time I directly connected what happened to him in Vietnam to who he was when I knew him. That's not to minimize or forget about his PTSD, but as I've said before, a lot of the consequences of that weren't material. I didn't see them firsthand. I knew he had a problem with drinking once. I knew he was quiet. But these things weren't direct connections. The sleeping, however, was. Things happened over there that changed his life forever. But they didn't just change his life, they also changed other people's lives. They were changed in physical, material ways. Quote, everyone is still jumpy over the Bien Hoa incident. That caught my attention when I read this entry. Bien Hoa wasn't just an isolated attack. It had been a direct and deadly assault on an American airbase, leaving dozens killed and wounded. I think about how that sort of tension must have compounded with the typhoon alerts that night, the possibility of flare ships, grounded by weather, and the constant flares from the 81 mortar just outside his bunk. It paints a picture of the man lying awake, on edge, uncertain of whether the enemy would attack through the chaos of the rain, or if sleep would come at all. Knowing that he'd sleep in his own room at home because of nightmares, it all fits. Things happened over there that changed his life forever, affecting not just his own sleep, but also his family's routines. For Poppy, a separate bedroom wasn't a luxury. It was a part of coping with the war's long shadow. When I think about those quiet nights at Meemaw and Poppy's, with him at his computer, I realize just how much he had to adjust and contain his own experiences, how they rippled out and reshaped the life we shared with him. This idea posed the question, where else did his experiences shape our family? In what small ways did his service in Vietnam change who we were? And how are those things still manifesting themselves daily? I guess we'll talk about it more later. The photo I chose for today depicts Huey's at night, participating in a training mission. Flares and tracer rounds filled the sky. The photo looks alien, ambient, and eerie. The film appears to have been exposed a little longer since it was nighttime after all. Though this isn't what Poppy would have seen at night, with the mortars launching outside of his room and flares lighting up the sky. Is it what it would have felt like? Does the photo represent the feeling of being in that situation? Could the same be said for how the VC felt? From the Diary of Bill Lowie, Tuesday, 17 November. No trouble last night. The typhoon veered off and missed us completely. We are on alert now to move to Saigon for a possible troop lift. The photo I chose for today is one that Meemaw handed me about 4 years ago. It was during COVID, and she was visiting and figured she'd share some stuff she found when she was cleaning out her trailer in Georgia. When she handed me this photo, along with a few others, in a nondescript orange folder, I didn't really think much about them at first. They were mostly prints of Poppy's slides. We all knew about his slides. The first time I saw them, as I've previously mentioned, was in North Carolina with the rest of my family, when Poppy presented them to us himself. They were, however, family photos. So, to be more precise, the first time I saw the photos of Vietnam was a few years after that, when he was trying to digitize them. We were visiting, and he had them in a box as he was slowly making his way through them. Eventually, he'd give up and have one of my cousins work on digitizing them instead. After thinking about the photos in the folder, I asked Meemaw where the rest of them were. I wanted the slides, and any other prints she may still have. They reminded me of North Carolina. They reminded me of one of the few times I was with my family and inarguably happy. Things didn't feel so broken with everyone just yet. She said she didn't know. She lost track of them after Poppy tried digitizing them. For about a week, I thought my cousin destroyed them because she didn't think they were important, or at least that was the story I was told. Luckily, she hadn't. Instead, they were kept in a box in my grandma's trailer at the bottom of a dingy closet. They had rubber bands holding stacks together, and the rubber had long since dried out and stuck to the slides, almost damaging a few, but that didn't matter. When Meemaw handed me the folder, it was like she handed me a bar of gold. The photos have obviously become very important to me since. They are a means for rediscovering a patriarch that has passed away and just so much more. My grandmother brought the slides along with the slide projector while visiting on her 80th birthday, and on that day I vowed never to part with them. Why? Because they were important to Poppy, and he was the opposite of materialistic. If he saved them, it must have been for a good reason, no matter what he might have said. I now feel like it's my responsibility to save them, to share them with people, to tell his story. That night, I stumbled across a few of the slides from Vietnam that were graphic but still undigitized. I needed to see what they looked like blown up onto a wall and not through a 110mm slit in cardboard. Later, I found myself placing family photos into the projector and allowing my grandmother to see them and reminisce about what they showed. They brought back many memories for my family. As we looked at them, I felt a moment of surreal purity. Here I was now, operating the slide projector for my family, like Poppy had done so many times so many years ago. Someone had to do it now that he was gone. At the time, we were watching one of my cousin's kids, which is a story for another time, but I promise we'll get to it, and I learned just how much I knew about the family. I was able to show her the photos of everyone in North Carolina, at the beach in Florida, or jumping into their above-ground pool. I pointed her grandfather out to her, who is my uncle. She had never really seen many pictures of him. His death was still pretty fresh for everyone. It was a pleasure to get the opportunity to do that. The photo itself is pretty funny, but it also brings up questions about what the soldiers in Vietnam thought they were doing over there, especially at this point so early on in the war. Was it really a fight against communism and to save the democratic, free, and American way of life? Or was this all just propaganda and totally something else? Does the true meaning have any bearing on what the soldiers thought and believed? Or what they fought and died for? Which is more important to us today? Also, if you're curious to know what Bud Bender looks like, Poppy's best friend who went on the double date with he and Meemaw, he's the guy on the right. I now see why Poppy grew out his mustache when he got back from the service. From the Diary of Bill Lowie, Wednesday, November 18th. Yesterday we closed in at Saigon along with every UH-1B outfit in the central and southern part of the country. We were told that this would be the biggest troop lift in the history of war. This is General Khan's chance to show the kind of force that he can raise on short notice. Our takeoff time was set for 5:30 this morning and landing in the LZ by 0700. We picked up our first load of troops at Bien Hoa. There were over 100 troop ships in the formation plus the gunships. The U.S. Air Force dropped bombs and strafed the LZ for about 10 minutes prior to our landing. Then, our gunships went in 3 minutes before us. In spite of that, we were still fired at as we entered and left. 2 of our gunships were knocked down, but there were no injuries that I know of. 3 or 4 of our troop ships found holes when we got back, but none of them serious. Our second lift of the day was made at about 1200. We took 600 troops into 2 separate LZs. Our gunships made a few passes over our LZ before we were to land, and we were not fired on. The landing area was presumed to be fairly safe. However, we had one crew chief hit in the leg by a shotgun blast from about 200 yards away, and several of our ships were fired on in the LZ. On our return, we heard an explosion as we neared Tan Son Hout Airport at Saigon. No one thought too much about. Later, we learned that while we were taking 1,500 troops 30 miles from Saigon to fight the VC, one of them planted a bomb in the cafeteria at the airport and killed about 7 Americans. The wounded report is not complete yet. All in all, a very interesting day. In this diary entry, Poppy recounts a day of intense and historic operations in Vietnam, offering us a vivid window into the complexities of the war effort. November 18, 1964 marked what was described to him as the biggest troop lift in the history of war, a monumental operation involving every UH-1B helicopter unit in the central and southern Vietnam. This operation was spearheaded by ARVN General Nguyen Khan, who was keen to demonstrate his ability to mobilize substantial forces on short notice. With takeoff set for 5:30, Poppy and his fellow aviators began their mission at Bien Hoa, lifting troops into landing zones, LZs, as part of a vast formation. The scale was staggering. Over 100 troop ships, supported by gunships and U.S. Air Force bombers. The operation's choreography was obviously meticulously planned. The Air Force bombarded the LZ for 10 minutes, softening enemy resistance, followed by a strafing run by gunships. Strafing refers to a military tactic where an aircraft flies low over a target area and uses onboard machine guns or autocannons to attack ground forces or vehicles. The term typically applies to attacks designed to suppress enemy troops, destroy vehicles, or damage installations. Despite these efforts, resistance remained fierce. The second lift, which occurred around noon, brought new challenges. Poppy's unit transported 600 troops to 2 separate LZs. Though the landing area was deemed relatively safe, sporadic resistance persisted. One detail underscores the asymmetrical nature of the conflict. While Poppy's unit was moving 1,500 troops miles away to engage the Viet Cong, one insurgent planted a bomb in the cafeteria at Tan Son Nhat Airport in Saigon. This act of sabotage killed 7 Americans and wounded others, highlighting the Viet Cong's ability to strike behind U.S. lines even during major offensives. The involvement of General Con adds a political layer to this narrative. In late 1964, South Vietnam's leadership was characterized chiefly by its instability, with Con at the center of it. His push to showcase military strength was as much about asserting authority at home as it was about fighting the Viet Cong. General Nguyen Con was a prominent yet controversial figure in South Vietnam's political and military history during the Vietnam War. Born in French Indochina, Con was educated in French military schools and joined the Vietnamese National Army during the First Indochina War. He rose to prominence during the 1960s, becoming a central player in South Vietnam's tumultuous politics. Con seized power in a bloodless coup in January 1964, ousting General Duong Van Minh and positioning himself as both Prime Minister and Chief of State. He attempted to consolidate authority and stabilize the nation, promoting nationalism and opposing communist influence, but his tenure was marred by infighting, public unrest, and struggles to unify the military leadership. Despite orchestrating major operations like the large troop lift described in Bill Lowie's diary, Con's leadership was often criticized as indecisive and autocratic. He was ultimately overthrown in 1965 and went into exile to the United States, where he lived until 2013, when he passed away at the age of 85. His time in power reflected the broader instability and challenges faced by South Vietnam during the war. As I read Poppy's words, I am struck by the stark contrasts of the day. Massive troop movements countered by the actions of a single saboteur. This juxtaposition speaks to the broader challenges of the Vietnam War. How do you fight an enemy that can engage on both a grand and intimate scale? The diary entry also invites us to consider the personal toll of war. Even in his understated tone, Poppy's descriptions convey the tension, exhaustion, and resilience of those involved. The danger was constant, yet missions continued, with little time to process events like the bombing at the airport. After all is said and done, he can only describe it as interesting. The photo I chose for today was taken from Poppy's helicopter as he was flying. Though it almost certainly does not depict the strafing or bombing he describes on this occasion, it does show an area on the ground in the midst of getting bombed. Once again, it's quite fantastic to see how he felt compelled to take a picture of something while flying. Good thing he had a co-pilot. It makes me think about the things I feel compelled to pull my phone out for or to snap a quick picture of. Knowing that his film was limited and he could get a bad shot, that makes the impulse to document this bombing all the more fascinating. From the Diary of Bill Lowie, Wednesday, 25 November. This has been a pretty uneventful week in our core area. There has been very little Viet Cong activity. However, we have heard through intelligence reports that 2 new VC battalions have moved into our area. Saigon has been having trouble with civil riots. Tonight, a new curfew law was issued in the Saigon-Chalon area. All Americans must be off the street between 10 p.m. and 5 a.m. I don't expect the present civil government to last out the year. Yesterday, my mission was to take the advisors for the Chua Doc area, an area right on the Cambodian border, on a recon of that area. They had a woman with them who claimed to have lived in a Viet Cong camp in that area. She had agreed to show the government troops where the area was for a price. She is a known VC agent, and the advisors were sure that when she was released, she would return to the camp and sell information to the VC for a price. This diary entry offers a snapshot of the complex and multifaceted challenges in South Vietnam during late 1964, a time when both the civil and military situations were increasingly fraught. South Vietnam in 1964 was plagued by political instability, with the government struggling to maintain control amidst internal discord and public dissatisfaction. By late November, General Nguyen Con's government was facing growing opposition, both from political factions and the general populace. Riots in Saigon, like the ones mentioned in the diary, were not uncommon and reflected frustration with corruption, inefficiency, and the perceived ineffectiveness of the regime. The imposition of curfews, like the one noted in the Saigon-Chalon area, was a regular response to civil unrest, but often further strained relations between the government and its citizens. Bill's skepticism about the civil government's longevity was well-founded. South Vietnam would see another coup before the end of the next year, underscoring the instability that hampered the war effort. The Chau Doc area, mentioned in the diary, lies along the Cambodian border in the Mekong Delta. This region was a key infiltration route for the Viet Cong, who used the porous border to smuggle supplies and personnel into South Vietnam. The area was notoriously difficult to secure due to its dense terrain and the proximity to neutral Cambodia, which often served as a safe haven for VC forces. Intelligence reports about the arrival of the 2 new VC battalions reflect the growing threat in the area, as the VC sought to strengthen their foothold. Recon missions like the one Bill describes were critical for identifying enemy positions but were fraught with risks, as the guerrilla tactics employed by the VC often made such operations hazardous and uncertain. The woman accompanying the advisors on this mission is an example of the moral and strategic ambiguities of the war. Informants played a crucial role in counterinsurgency efforts, but their motivations were often suspect. The belief that she might return to the VC after completing her task underscores the lack of trust and the fluid allegiances in the region. For U.S. and ARVN forces, this dynamic complicated efforts to gain reliable intelligence, forcing them to navigate a landscape where allies and enemies could shift unpredictably. She also proves that in a time of war, such as this, there were opportunities for the local men and women. Simply by selling information, whether it be true or not, she was not only protected from the violence, but also compensated for what she knew. This entry also reflects the broader tension between the military's immediate tactical concerns and the civil government's struggle for legitimacy. While U.S. forces and advisors focused on counterinsurgency efforts, the South Vietnamese government was losing the battle for hearts and minds, a critical aspect of any counterinsurgency campaign. The instability in Saigon and the distrust even among supposed allies, like the woman informant, mirrored the larger issues of the war effort: a fractured society and a difficult-to-pin-down enemy. And there it is. This is the final entry in Bill's diary. As I've mentioned before, he stopped keeping it for a reason, one we may or may not find out later. Though I've read through these contents many times before, I've never had the opportunity, until now, to read them with such clarity or comprehension. In only a span of 51 days, he wrote over 20 entries and discussed PSYOPs missions, spying, troop lifts, Medevac, and much more. Had that period been all he experienced, it probably would have been enough to change anyone's life. But there's much more to come. It's been my pleasure to read these entries to you and comment on them. I hope you have enjoyed. I'm excited for what's next, the letters. Our following episode will be the first letter. We will read the first message beginning with the eponymist, Dearest Suzie. Things change now. Remember, he's writing to his wife. He is concealing some things. She is one of his few lifelines to the world back home. She is with their 3 children in Florida, living near his parents. If he tells her things, they are going to be softened, so she can stomach them. Knowing this makes what is to come all the more painful. The photo I chose for today depicts a woman on what seems to be a motorized bicycle. Her pure white dress captivates me. Acting as a sign of purity or innocence in an otherwise stained and burdened time and place. Could she be one of those people who are informants for the highest bidders? Is she outside of the airfield? Why take this photo? Once again, we see a person who seemingly belongs to the landscape. It would likely be difficult for Poppy to communicate with her. She could be hiding things. This blends her in with the background. She becomes a part of the setting and not a character in this story. What an interesting consideration. Monday, November 30th. My dearest Suzie, how are you and the boys getting along? I guess they are all really looking forward to Christmas. I am off today. That is, I am so far. I was supposed to be off yesterday. So, yesterday I got up at 8 o'clock and had a nice long breakfast, taking my time about everything, figuring that I had the whole day to write to you and relax. I was off because I had flown 99 hours this month up through Saturday, and I was beat. I am the high man in the platoon on time this month. Anyway, yesterday, about 10 o'clock, the operations officer came in and told me that he had to have someone to take a real short mission, about 30 minutes. He asked me if I minded taking it, and what could I say? I was the only pilot left here. I wound up flying 4 hours of combat time, and naturally, that is the most tiring kind. So, I'm trying to stay on the ground today. I think that this month has tired me out more than anything I've ever done. I guess I've never really told you anything about the combat flying over here. In fact, I've avoided it, because I know what a worrywart you are. But yesterday, I'll tell you about. I think that you have a right to know what I'm doing, but just remember that worrying isn't going to help any. The reason I'm telling you, too, is that I was so sick from what I saw yesterday that I came in last night and got just as drunk as I could ever get, and I don't think I will ever be the same again. Since I have been over here, I've been shot at 6 times. I have landed with mortars exploding 50 feet away. I've seen dead men piled up like wood piles. I've hauled wounded men out of areas that should have been dead. And all of that hasn't bothered me too much. But yesterday morning, I flew a colonel into an outpost that had been very overrun by the Viet Cong. They were still around, and I got shot at again going in, by the way. That outpost had been burned to the ground. Every man, woman, and child there had been shot and then burned. There were dead bodies everywhere we looked. I know that I probably should not have told you about all this. I had wanted to wait until I got home and let you read my diary after it was too late to worry, but this morning I feel so rotten, and I want to tell someone how I feel, and since I've always told you my troubles before, I guess I can't stop now. There is a constant fear here in flying. Well, on the ground too. There's a Viet Cong battalion about 2 to 5 miles from us, and they take pot shots at the compound pretty often. But enough of that. I know that I'll be sorry for telling you all this later. Well, today is payday, and that is a good thing too. I'm out of stamps, envelopes, and this is my last piece of paper. Take care of yourself and the boys. I love you all very much. All my love. Bill. I feel there isn't much I personally have to say about today's letter. The first letter. At least the first one Meemaw gave me, anyway. It's emotional, raw, and honest. It's heartbreaking, and gives us a look at not just what someone like Poppy was going through over there, but also what they were telling their loved ones back home, and what those people had to carry with them. What did Meemaw think about after she received this letter? Did she hug their boys a little tighter that night? Did she turn on the news and hope to learn more about the war? Did she pick up a bottle herself? Growing up, I always knew that my family struggled with addiction and substance abuse. It was no secret that Poppy was once an alcoholic. Until very recently, my other grandfather could also be characterized as one, though he only had a few drinks at Thanksgiving dinner because it was a holiday after all. The list could go on. That being said, I understood how destructive alcohol could be and what it could do to someone. Not just to one someone, but to everyone they loved, that watched them suffer, that saw them embarrass themselves, that were on the other end of swings of belts and fists. Because of this, I made a promise to myself when I was young that I wouldn't drink until I was 21. I know that seems arbitrary and naive, but I needed to. I wanted to know that I could, if even for the first part of my life, live without touching the things that had brought so much pain to people in my family, and still continues to today. I'm proud to say I kept that promise to myself. I certainly was challenged along the way. In high school, spending New Year's with my friends and their parents who had more liberal views on temperance. In college, going to parties where people were expected to take shots to enter and explaining, like the buzzkill I am, that I won't drink because I didn't want to be like my grandfather. Wow. That's an interesting thing to think about. Of all this time I've spent talking about him and how proud of his service I am, I was pretty vehemently against who he really was for most of his life. Figure that one out. Thankfully, my experiences as a young man weren't like the movies. No one pressured me too much. Most of the time people were respectful and actually admired the decision. I even had one person tell me once that they figured someone in my position would be arrogant and think they could have mastery over those problems, having seen other people struggle with it and knowing the pitfalls to avoid. They said they thought it was cool I showed humility. At the end of the day, who knows if it actually taught me anything, though? Maybe people just thought I was being self-righteous. Maybe I was. Maybe I actually humbled myself when I took my first drink, proving I wasn't any better than Poppy. Or anyone else for that matter. The photo I chose for today depicts who I believe to be Poppy's co-pilot as they were making a bank turn above a burning village. Could this be the place he went and saw these things? Did they set them ablaze? I'm Alex Lowie, and I hope you have enjoyed listening to this episode of Dearest Suzie, and receiving messages from the past that my Poppy wrote exactly 60 years ago. I sincerely appreciate your time and interest. Please consider following the podcast on your preferred platform, and if you're enjoying it, I kindly ask that you take the time to rate the show and leave a review. Also, please follow the project on YouTube, X, and Instagram. All likes, comments, shares, and reviews will help grow the reach of this story. The links for these things should be in the description of this episode. Please feel free to email me at dearestsuziepodcast@gmail.com if you have anything you'd like to say. I'd love to chat or to hear about your stories as well. Thank you for listening, and God bless.